So hello and welcome. My name is Jane Heisler, and I'm a member of the Cascade Volcanoes Broadband, or chapter. We call them broadbands in Broadspeak, for the Great Old Broads for Wilderness. We are a grassroots conservation group that has 40 chapters nationwide, with thousands of women and men who want to advocate for public lands and join in education and stewardship projects to promote the protection of and additions to public lands. We're excited today to be able to offer this webinar. Although we had hoped to see you all in person, this method will allow us to record the event and then share it with others who can't be on the computer tonight. So that said, this is a new approach for us. So bear in mind that we're learning as we go. Felice Kelly on our leadership team, who was just speaking, and her friend Kat will be managing the call and questions at the end. We couldn't have done this without you, Felice. Thank you. So we hope that you will learn more about, or something about, the Jordan Cove project and the pipeline, which would cut through much of southern Oregon, and the LNG terminal, which would be located on the beautiful Oregon coast. Or if you already know something about Jordan Cove, that you are able to learn about some additional aspects of it. New as of today, of course, is the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has approved the frack gas facility and pipeline. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means for our state and why, for the sake of our rivers, forests, oceans, health, and climate change, we should continue to say no to this project. So we have, Felice, did you want to talk a little bit about COVID?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a quick moment before we started. I think for everyone on this call, it's been a really tough week. And before we begin, I'd like to take a moment for us to send healing and peace to all those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think part of this, as we try to work to build community together, some of that will have to be online for a little while. I just wanted to mention also before we proceed, the plan is to take questions, but we'd like you to enter your questions in the chat box. And if you take your cursor, if you're on a computer or I think on your phone, if you take your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you should see a little chat bubble. And you may have seen people talking in the chat on the side. If you enter your questions in the chat, we're going to kind of keep track of it as the presentations go and collate them into sort of general questions that we can ask our panelists at the end. And with that, I'd like to ask Frances to kick it off. Well, I guess Jane will introduce her first.
Well, we've got 4 speakers. Frances is our first one, and Frances is an activist and property owner. She's a member of the Rogue Broadband in Southern Oregon, and the former conservation director with Cascade Wildlands. And she's also a board member with the Oregon Women's Land Trust, which owns property along the pipeline. So Frances, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and happy equinox to everybody. Today's the day. And I live in Southern Oregon. I'm here outside of Roseburg talking to you today on this new medium. And I am a board member of Oregon Women's Land Trust that owns some land near Days Creek. In 2006, we received a letter that the pipeline would like to come through our property, please. So we've been in this fight for a long time. Now, I'd like to start out by giving you some terminology that we're going to be using today in this presentation. The Jordan Cove Energy Project has 2 parts. It has the export terminal proposed for Coos Bay and the Pacific Connector gas pipeline across Southern Oregon. We will be talking about FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So everyone, you're going to hear us say FERC, FERC. That is the U.S. federal agency in charge of the environmental analysis for this project and the granting or not of the right of eminent domain to seize private property for this project. They issued a final environmental impact statement in November of 2019. And as Jane said just this morning, they issued a final decision conditionally approving the Jordan Cove project. And those conditions involve procuring the permission from the state of Oregon. I'm sure Damon will talk more about that in detail later on in this presentation. But the FERC decision this morning could also mean threats of court proceedings to condemn private properties, and that will also be discussed by Pam later on in this presentation. Right now, next, I'd like to give you a little history of this project. Now, this project was originally proposed in 2004 to import natural gas to California, and it used about the same pipeline path that we see today. Now, the import project was conditionally approved by FERC in 2009, conditionally approved, similar to today's decision. But right after that decision, fracking took off, and suddenly the Americas were suddenly awash in natural gas. So they never acted on that 2009 approval. It was abandoned. And in 2012, it was replaced with a request to export liquefied natural gas to Asia. After 3 years of an environmental analysis, in the March of 2016, FERC surprised everyone with a denial of this export terminal. Now, FERC was known as the rubber stamp organization, so we were all shocked when they deny it, but they determined it was not in the public interest, especially since Jordan Cove had no contracts to sell the gas. Jordan Cove appealed, and FERC again denied that appeal in December of 2016. 1 month later, Trump was inaugurated, and a few days later, Jordan Cove refiled to start over again. And now we are in the final stages of that third try. Verizon had owned the project up until 2017, and when Pembina, also from Alberta, Canada, bought out Verizon, and so inherited this project. A few more details about the project. The terminal, as y'all know, this terminal would be located near the city of Coos Bay in the Bay of Coos Bay. The gas would be super cooled to liquefy it. If you make it really cold, it liquefies it, and that compresses it. So it's known as liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and it's compressed so they can put more on ocean tankers. The terminal would be built on unstable sand dunes in a tsunami subduction earthquake zone, in an area of high winds and ship disasters, and directly in the path of the regional airport runway. Here you can kind of see the runway of the airport. The runway kind of faces right here, where there will be 2 storage tanks, huge storage tanks holding LNG, 42 million gallons each. Now, it requires electricity to keep that liquefied natural gas liquefied. And if it loses the electricity, it will start to regasify and expand, which would be catastrophic, which is why, of course, the earthquake tsunami issue we feel is a big problem. In 2018, a study was done that found that the terminal would be the largest source of climate pollution in the state of Oregon. The terminal would emit the annual equivalent of emissions from 8 million vehicles. So that is what we would be adding to Oregon's greenhouse gas budget if this was ever proposed. And a word about these ocean tankers that is hope that they would come to this terminal. is expected that 120 of these huge ocean tankers would come. That would be 240 trips across the ocean and whale migration routes. These are the largest vessels in the world. They would be over 3 football fields long, 950 feet long, 150 feet wide. So it means massive dredging needs to be done in the Bay of Coos Bay here in order to fit these huge ocean tankers. And it will be difficult for any other users of the bay to exist there, as all fishing and recreation boats and airplanes will be restricted while one of these massive ships has to come 7 miles up this access channel right here. Here's a few words about the pipeline. 230 miles long from Malin, Oregon, right here near Klamath Falls, 230 miles to Coos Bay. It would be a 3-foot diameter pipe needing a 95-foot wide clear-cut right-of-way, plus a lot of that right-of-way has to be 150 feet wide because there's many places they need extra work areas. The pipe would be buried anywhere from 18 inches to 36 inches deep. Now, it starts in Malin, Oregon, because in Malin, there's some existing pipelines coming from Canada to bring Canadian gas there. This is the GTN pipeline. There's also the Ruby pipeline here. It crosses, 2/3 of it is on private land, 1/3 on public lands. That's 80 miles on public lands. And here you can see where it goes through the Wainema National Forest, the Rogue River National Forest, Medford BLM. This is the Umpqua National Forest, Roseburg BLM, crosses Interstate 5 near Myrtle Creek, Coos Bay BLM, and on to Coos Bay. This pipeline would carry high pressure, unodorized, fracked natural gas. It would require almost 2,000 acres of Southern Oregon forest to be clear cut. It would cross 485, more or less, waterways in Southern Oregon, many of those fish-bearing streams. You know, it crosses major rivers like the Klamath, the Rogue, the Umpqua. Twice it crosses the Umpqua, the Coquille, and the Coos rivers. And there is a lot of private land, and over 90 private landowners have refused to grant access for this Canadian project. Now, the pipeline itself has some safety issues. The pipeline goes through classes of safety regulations, class 1 through class 4. And class 4 is for areas of high population like the city of Coos Bay. Class 1 is in rural areas, and rural is defined as less than 10 families along 1 mile of that pipeline. So that's called class 1. Class 1 has the lowest safety standards allowed, class 4 the highest. So 70% of the pipeline is in a class 1 area where Pembina is allowed to save a lot of money by cutting safety corners, especially by using thinner pipes. They can also bury the pipes higher, have less welds, less inspections, and a host of other cost-saving, reduced safety measures. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe if it blows up, only a few of us will die, not very many. And most of the forests it goes through are class 1 reduced safety areas. Southern Oregon, as many of you know, have what is known as fire adapted forests, where our forests burn naturally and they burn often. Pembina says, don't worry about forest fires because the soil will insulate the pipe from heat. However, professionals disagree with that assessment. The Corps of Engineers, for instance, points to the numerous piles of logging slash that will be left to deter off-highway vehicles recreating there. And so if one of those slash piles were to catch fire, or if a burning tree falls onto the right-of-way, the Corps believes it would compromise the integrity of the pipe. And then there's the block valves. Here's a picture of a typical block valve. There are 18 of these block valves spaced along the pipeline route where the pipe comes above ground, and that has valves that can shut off different sections of the pipe. So, you know, who's going to drive through a burning forest to turn off that valve? These are not automatic shutoff valves. In 2015, the Stouts Creek fire east of Canyonville burned over 17 miles of the proposed pipeline route, including the site of one of these block valves. And that fire was fought with heavy equipment on ridge tops, the same place the pipe would be buried. What could go wrong? Now, a little bit more information on the federal forest impacts. This pipeline will go through 4 national forests and 3 BLM districts. The 80 miles of pipeline through public forest will cause over 1,300 acres of clear cuts. And of those forests, 65% had been set aside for wildlife habitat like spotted owls, marbled murrelets, and coho salmon. 750 acres to be clear cut are old growth forests. The pipeline would also, it would violate, I mean, that's normally not legal in these forests to do that. It would also violate restrictions on things like how much soil is disturbed, or visual retention requirements like, for instance, clear cutting across the Pacific Crest Trail is usually not allowed. Now, to compensate for this harm, mitigations are proposed on the national forest lands. For instance, to compensate for clear cutting wildlife reserves, it's called late succession reserves, like the one seen in this picture, mitigation would designate replacement wildlife reserves. But mitigations are only on Forest Service lands. On BLM lands, there was no timely mitigation offered. Logging on BLM lands would occur on over 47 miles on BLM lands. On BLM lands, they would clear cut over 700 acres. And this would hit marbled murrelets especially hard because of that edge effect. It's not just the acres that's clear cut, it's all the edge effect that goes on into the forest. But not one BLM mitigation project, not one, was analyzed in the EIS. And this is because in July of 2018, the Trump administration prohibited the BLM from asking for any mitigation for any damages to BLM lands. Isn't that a crazy thing to do? But that's what they did. So instead of mitigating these otherwise illegal practices, the BLM will just change their forest plans to make clear cutting in wildlife and streamside reserves legal. The BLM will reallocate all lands within the pipeline right-of-way to a district reserve to be managed only for the purposes of the Pacific Connector pipeline. 885 acres would go into this new BLM reserve. It's kind of hard to believe that a foreign-owned fossil fuel corporation will be given their own reserve on our BLM lands with virtually no mitigation cost to Pembina at all. Now, the Great Old Broad submitted a protest of this BLM decision, and we can thank our coalition lawyers for bringing these issues to court if BLM doesn't change their mind. I'd also like to talk about another significant issue, more about the endangered species. This project is so broad that it touches 35 rare species protected under the Endangered Species Act. And almost half of those, 15 species, are expected to be hit hard enough to harm or kill some of them. That's called a likely to adversely affect. Now note that 3 of these species, the blue, the fin, and the humpback whales, are expected to be harmed. Whale impacts are due to noise and to potential ship strikes with the extra 240 trips of these huge ships across their migration routes. Unfortunately, the National Marine Fisheries Service recently gave an incidental take permit, some people call it an incidental kill permit, allowing Jordan Cove to harm or kill as many whales as they need to get 240 ships back and forth across that ocean. The National Marine Fisheries Service did not specify an upper limit of whales they could kill, just whatever they happen to take with 240 trips a year. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also recently gave Pembina permission to harm or kill whatever terrestrial endangered species they needed to take to build the Canadian pipeline, like owls and murrelets. And I also want to say a word about our tribes here. The tribes have been a strong partner in fighting this pipeline. At least 5 tribes are opposed to this project where the pipeline would impact their watersheds and ancestral lands. Now, for instance, the Klamath tribe wrote to FERC. They said, the route of the pipeline goes through areas where villages once existed, and it may unearth human remains, since graves with human remains have been found in the area. The route would also go under the Klamath River and the Rogue River, which since time immemorial have been and continue to be important sources of fish for tribal members. Now, in conclusion, I want to end by saying that though FERC approved this project this morning, we believe we can stop it. The state of Oregon, for instance, has been diligent in making sure that the state permits meet legal muster. We can thank the lawyers on our team from Craig and Sierra Club and the Western Environmental Law Center and independent lawyers like Tonya Morrow for giving us their free time for this project. And we have the public support on our side. Polling shows that only 4% of Oregonians say they strongly support this project, just 4%, right? Now, landowners were instrumental in stopping this project in 2016, and they're instrumental in helping to stop this project now. Pamela Brown Ordway is going to talk more about the landowner issues. Thank you.
So
Okay.
Oh, are you gonna wave me in?
I am going to give you a little introduction.
Okay.
That's okay, Pamela.
Absolutely. I was so anxious.
So, Pamela, and thank you, Francis, for letting us know about all of those impacts on endangered species and Native Americans and the political and too many to mention. So our next speaker is Pam Ordway, and she is a property owner along the pipeline route. And Pam is a lifelong Oregonian with deep roots in Southern Oregon. She grew up with 5 brothers and sisters on a farm in Camas Valley. And if you don't have your map handy, that's about 30 miles southwest of Roseburg. I had to look it up. Both Pam and her siblings still are associated with the farm. Her brother and his wife are living in the original farmhouse, and Pam and her other 4 siblings manage the back half of the property. They've been actively opposing the project since its inception more than a decade ago. Pam is a member of the Landowners Advisory Committee, a group of directly impacted landowners opposed to the pipeline and the project. She's also a board member of Greater Good Oregon, a nonprofit organized to help educate, excuse me, and support impacted property owners fighting against the use of eminent domain by a foreign corporation to seize private land for corporate gain. So we've invited Pam to talk about her experience and how she and her neighbors are being impacted by this. Go ahead, Pam.
Thanks. So the highly pressurized pipeline that's supposed to carry fracked gas to the Jordan Cove Energy Facility would cross the family farm I grew up on. It's in Camas Valley. It's a town of about 500 or so. As you said, it's about 30 miles southwest of Roseburg. It's up in the Coast Range. And the route of the pipeline would cut a diagonal path across our property. And what that would mean for us is that the pipeline would pretty much impact every part of our land. The easement itself would initially be roughly 100 feet for construction purposes, and then would end up being a 90-foot wide permanent easement. The process in a nutshell goes like this. Construction workers come in, they clear the land of all the trees, dig a trench that's a little less than 10 feet deep, start laying pipeline, and then cover up the pipeline and exit, returning only to spray herbicides on the easement to help vegetation growth down. I suppose they'd occasionally come and inspect it, but I'm not really sure how often. What I do know is that this would leave a permanent scar on the land. On our property, the pipeline would cross the Cocoa River and 2 other creeks, so that we aren't only talking about ripping up farm and forest land, we're also talking about ripping up trees that shade waterways, damaging fish habitat, and diverting rivers and streams, possibly permanently altering their course. In addition to the damage to the land, the pipeline will dramatically limit how we use our land in the future. About half of our land is farm and pasture land and half's timberland. We've kept herbicides off our land for the past decade. That would change. We've tried drilling a well, and it's pretty common to have to drill several times before you get a well that produces any water. Having the pipeline cross our land is going to limit our options on where we can drill. If we want to put in fencing for livestock or construct outbuildings, having the pipeline running diagonally through the property will restrict us as well. It's also going to limit what crops we can plant. Things that grow particularly well, like Christmas trees, timber, grapes, and fruit trees, won't be allowed in the easement. Any place we want to cross the pipeline with heavy farm equipment, we need to build up a berm so that the weight doesn't compress the pipeline. This land has been in our family since 1917. After my father passed away in 2003, one of my brothers kept the farm and 100 acres, and the other 5 of us share the remaining 153 acres of farm and forest land. We care deeply for this land. It's a part of who we are. It's a glue that keeps us connected to each other and our past, and it's where we're putting our hopes for the future. Our father is buried nearby, as are his parents and his parents' parents. When our father passed away, we knew we'd face challenges keeping the land in the family. We all had our own families and jobs elsewhere. Only one of us lived in the area. The easiest thing to do would have been to sell out to a timber company and walk away with the cash. We all knew that. But when it came down to the actual thought of selling the land and letting go, we just couldn't do it. We knew it wasn't going to be easy. We knew there was a potential for disagreements on how the land should be managed or what would be the best way to move forward. And those were all challenges we felt able to face head on. What we could not anticipate, however, was having to fight off the threat of condemnation by a gas pipeline company. It was back in 2007 when the first permits were applied for, and it's been an ongoing battle ever since. And the process goes like this. You get a letter from FERC telling you that a company has applied for a permit to build a pipeline across your land. If you want to participate in the process, you need to become an intervener. And I'll say the process to become an intervener is not easy. They don't make it easy. They don't make it easy to understand. You get a notice from the pipeline company saying they want access to your land to survey. And based on our experience, whether or not you agree to having your property surveyed, colored flags start showing up, tacked to trees or tied onto bushes. And then you get a letter from the pipeline saying they want to buy an easement. And next comes the land agents. They mail, they call, they send registered letters, and finally they show up on your doorstep again and again and again. I live in Portland, and they kept coming to the door when I wasn't home, forcefully ringing the doorbell. My daughter was in high school at the time, and the persistence and frequency was beginning to rattle her. So I finally told them, come when I'm home. So they did, and I cracked the front door open and let them tell their story while they stood on my front steps. But imagine if you're elderly and you live alone, far from your nearest neighbor. The constant pestering is at best unsettling, and at worst, scary and intimidating. And then you get a bunch of unsolicited letters from out-of-state eminent domain attorneys or others who can facilitate the process to get you the best deal. Or you get a letter from someone who tells you that they know just how to keep you from having to pay capital gains tax on the settlement from the pipeline company. And the tone of these letters is all the same. Someone will be building a pipeline across your land, whether or not you want it. When permits were first applied for, we didn't register interveners. We didn't know if we could or should, or even how to do it if we'd wanted to. The communication from FERC was pretty intimidating and gave the impression that the pipeline was a foregone conclusion. It was as if there was a runaway train barreling down on us, and our only decision was when to jump to get out of the way. We've learned a lot since then, and frankly, it hasn't been from FERC or elected officials, particularly local elected officials. It's been from other landowners, and in recent years, local environmental groups. And one of the most important things we've learned is this: we are outmatched at every level. It's as if we are suited up for flag football and we've gotten tossed into the NFL playoffs. Nobody tells you what you're supposed to be doing to protect yourself or what your rights are. As landowners opposed to the pipeline, we don't have an endless supply of attorneys lined up to help us navigate the system. We don't have funds to produce reports holding the facts in just the right light so they validate our view. Nor do we have funds to hire lobbyists so they can hobnob with Congress members to share how our lives are and will be impacted by this. I'd tell you, it's no accident participating in the process is hard for landowners. 95% of the landowners along the route are 55 or older. 75% are 65 and older. Many of them do not have computers. Internet access along much of the route of the pipeline is spotty or non-existent. Many counties and small towns no longer have libraries, and if they do, they're miles away from landowners and often staffed by volunteers with limited hours. For anyone trying to file objections or even just stay up to date on the process, it's a real challenge. On one of my first trips to visit my neighbor just before we attended a local planning commission meeting, she was sitting at her kitchen table, typing a letter voicing her objection. Typing a letter on a typewriter, because that was the only method available to her. For the typical landowner, this process is overwhelming, and it's scary to realize that you're ill prepared to do battle with the Leviathan heading your way. Unless you're familiar with legal terminology, the documents sent to you look like they're written in a foreign language. What's an intervener? Who's LUBA? Why do I have to tell the Army Corps of Engineers about the rivers on my property? You quickly realize that carefully thought out arguments against a project don't count because they aren't framed as legal objections, or they're brought up at the wrong venue, or you miss the deadline. Your story of generations on a land or how it's going to threaten your drinking water or income are just waved away with a flick of a wrist. And I'll be honest, I'm pretty sure all of us at some time during this have said, maybe we should just give up, throw in the towel, take the money and run. We're trying to live our lives, take care of our families and our land, plan for the future, but we can't give up. I tell people, even if I wanted to quit fighting, I don't think I could. There's too much at stake. And as we all know now, that fight just became very real and very immediate. We've been fighting this fight for so many years, over a decade, that I think we all kind of just thought of that as some project was somewhere out in the ether, something like a dark storm cloud looming on the horizon. But with today's news, it just became a violent storm raining down hard on us. We don't know exactly what the immediate future holds. I know there are some legal challenges that will be filed immediately by some environmental groups and others, but as they work their way through the court, we're still going to be fighting the wolf at our door. We've been told previously that what will likely happen is Pembina will file condemnation lawsuits against us in the court right away. We don't know if they'll file against each of us individually or just lump us all together and file one big lawsuit. They could also file quick take, and what that means is that they go to court and ask the court to begin pre-construction activities on our property as we fight back. And the other court battles wage on elsewhere. If quick take is granted, they get to begin work even before we come to an agreed upon price or receive any compensation for the easement. I will tell you, as a landowner, this is terrifying. I know that pushing back and not coming to terms on an easement might mean that I have protected my land if this project is stopped through the courts elsewhere, but it also means that I'm having to spend an unknown amount of money for a very uncertain outcome. As part of the Greater Good Board, we've called and spoken with many eminent domain attorneys, and a lot of them have told us almost immediately they can't help because at one time or another they worked with Pembina or others who support the project. Those who have said they have no conflict of interest and are willing to help usually start with rates around $500 an hour. If you engage an attorney, then the landowner needs to set aside costs not only for attorneys, but for appraisers and experts to testify on your behalf in court. We've heard prices from $5,000 to $10,000, depending on what your unique circumstances are. As you can imagine, for a lot of landowners, their property is pretty much their most important, if not their only asset. Trying to come up with that type of money to defend their land is a real challenge, and many won't be able to do it. We've encouraged all landowners to at least consult an eminent domain attorney so they know their rights. Greater Good Oregon is trying to raise money to help support those landowners who've joined the Pacific Connector Easement Action Team, which is a group of landowners who have not signed easements and are committed to continuing the fight. Greater Good's mission is to support them by keeping them connected to each other, keeping them up to date with what's going on, and hopefully to help them reduce the cost of going forward with this fight. At our last count, we had about 30 PCAP members, and after today, we expect that number might grow, as there are still roughly 90 landowners who have not signed easements. If you'd like to help support the landowners on the front lines by donating to Greater Good, there's a link that will take you to Our Lands and Our Lives webpage. And on that webpage, you can see some of the stories that have impacted landowners, and there's a spot where you can contribute if you're so inclined. This past decade or so has been hell, with the uncertainty and drain on our time and resources. But I want to also acknowledge that through this ongoing battle, I've had the privilege of meeting so many wonderful people whose paths I otherwise would not have crossed. And for that, I'm grateful. I know today's news was a huge blow. I still literally feel it in my gut. But I know the battle isn't over. And I know that this project is being opposed by a very diverse group of people. And that gives me the strength to continue the fight and the hope that in the end we'll win. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that heartfelt story about your and your neighbor's experience going through this and fighting the Goliath. We are going to be handing out a sheet later in the presentation about lots of other, this particular organization, but also other ones that you can contribute to. So again, thank you, Pam. And I'd like to introduce now Damon Motz-Storey. Damon is the Healthy Climate Director with Physicians for Social Responsibility, who will discuss the impacts on our health of methane gas and climate change. Mr. Storey, he uses he, him, or they, them pronouns, is now advocating for action on the public health crisis of climate change. He was born and raised in the Rocky Mountains, of Colorado, he first heard about the Jordan Cove LNG project from a college roommate who was the nephew of two landowners on the pipeline route in Jackson County. Now, Damon is honored to work in coalition with impacted communities in Southern Oregon to stop the pipeline and LNG terminal by calling attention to the huge list of unmitigable health and safety threats it poses, such as drinking water contamination, air and noise pollution, and the social and health impacts of losing existing jobs in fishing and tourism. I'll turn it over to you, Damon.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. It is such a privilege and a pleasure to be on this panel webinar with you all this evening. And I just want to say how glad I am that we have been able to, I feel like it's actually a real symbolic thing that we are able to so resiliently and flexibly transition to a format that works given the circumstances. I think that's a microcosm of how the coalition and the movement to stop the Jordan Cove LNG project really has been, you know, unbelievable circumstances, like really David and Goliath-esque circumstances, and yet we just keep on triumphing in so many different ways, despite the unbelievable odds. So I'm really excited to talk with you all about some of the work that Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility has done to look at the health and safety impacts of this project. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory landscape and the kind of context within which today's FERC decision comes. And I also want to just mention that it also is a deep honor to work on this, because at 26 years old, it's feels very urgent to me to do everything that we can to preserve a livable climate for my generation and for the generations to come. And so it is incredibly meaningful for me to work on this campaign, and I'm glad to be in coalition with Francis and Pam and Anu and so many people. So, all right, so where are we right now in the context of today's decision? So as the big graphic on the right-hand side here says, with 0 state permits, FERC issues approval of Jordan Cove LNG. And that's really critical, right? These 3 major state permits from the state of Oregon are essential in order for the project to be built, and it has no future without these permits. The first one that was denied was the Section 401 Clean Water Act permit that's administered by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. They issued a very in-depth denial of this permit in May of 2019, citing a wide range of impacts to drinking water and water resources in the state of Oregon. And then fast forward to January of 2020, after a long 2-year process of seeking out the removal fill permit from the Oregon Department of State Lands that would allow for things like dredging and such like that. And then we saw that the company, Pembina, withdrew their application for this permit when it became very clear that the wind was not blowing in their direction, right? That the Department of State Lands was insisting upon a decision to occur, and they had not actually provided the requested information. And so, fearing denial, Pembina went, whoop, we're going to withdraw our permit application for this, just days before we were expecting a decision on that permit. And then really quickly, before we were expecting a FERC decision on Jordan Cove LNG, the day before we were expecting a decision from the federal agency, the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development issued a lengthy objection saying that there were an enormous amount of harmful impacts from the Pacific Connector pipeline and Jordan Cove LNG export terminal that would impact the coastal zone along Coos County and Douglas County. And that denial came through in February of 2020. One of the other pieces of news that came today is that Pembina has appealed that decision to the US Secretary of Commerce. And so that is an ongoing process there. But even if that permit denial were to be reversed, these Clean Water Act and removal fill permits are essential for the project's future. And we have many opportunities to stay with the state of Oregon in making sure that those denials remain strong. And we also get a little bit of a moment to celebrate. We're really seeing an incredible marshaling of Oregon leaders coming together and saying, this needs to stop. And Senator Ron Wyden issued a lengthy statement today in response to the FERC approval, saying that he felt that the process was rigged in favor of the fossil fuel industry, and that he could not support the project because of the threat of eminent domain on landowners. And so I just want to recognize and take a moment to acknowledge that probably a lot of the people on this webinar were involved in putting pressure on Senator Wyden to oppose this project. And today he has finally taken a strong opposition stance against it. So that's an amazing cause for celebration. And also, meanwhile, Governor Kate Brown, who has been under a tremendous amount of pressure to oppose the project, has also issued a statement saying that she will use every available tool to prevent the company from taking early action to condemn private property or clear land. And so we're seeing more and more that Oregon state agencies and elected officials are making very strong statements about protecting Southwestern Oregonians from this particular issue. This, however, comes during very troubling times, right? Sandy Lyon, an impacted landowner in Days Creek, gave a really great quote for our press materials today that really, I think, just brought it all home for me, that it's absolutely outrageous that FERC would issue a decision like this in the middle of a major global health emergency, a time when many people cannot leave their homes safely, to layer on this added anxiety around the use of eminent domain on people's property when we are all, socially distancing ourselves and doing what we can to mitigate this public health crisis is simply cruel. And the response that we will have to it is to stand firm against this project and make sure that the state of Oregon does the same. And then the chairman of the Klamath Tribes, Don Gentry, who has been a really amazing advocate on behalf of the Klamath Tribes against this project, also issued a statement expressing their disappointment with the approval today, and just reaffirmed how vital the cultural and natural resources are that would be impacted by this project. So we carry on. It's quite a disappointing turn of events today, but we can do what we've been doing very well for the past many, many years and ensure that this project has no future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the health impacts of the project in a couple of different areas and categories, and I'll include a link in the very last slide of my presentation that will point you in the direction of our longer fracked gas health report, which we did with Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility to take a look at the many different ways in which gas projects like this impact the health and safety of communities nearby gas infrastructure. So as Francis had said, there's a lot of waterway crossings proposed by this facility, which means a really big risk to drinking water for about 160,000 Oregonians in Southern Oregon. So this is, we're not talking about, just a few people whose drinking water could be contaminated in the event of a frack out where the pipeline is ruptured in some kind of a way and gas gets into the local environment or some sort of explosion. There's some really serious consequences that would be posed to drinking water from that. And then as Francis also said, old growth forest and endangered species habitat would be cleared. Our health is connected to the health of the natural environment. And we need our natural spaces for things like carbon sequestration, for example, and it also keeps our air clean. Eminent domain on landowners, I think Pam really well articulated that there's been a really profound mental health impact of simply the threat of this project and how long it's been looming, right? And so in addition to how terrible it would be to uproot people from their land, simply the specter of this project looming over communities for so long has a really significant and serious toll. And then the indirect health impacts of climate change that would come from this massive contributor to the global climate crisis is not to be discounted, right? So we heard 8 million vehicles on the road is a comparison of the greenhouse gas impact of this project. Another comparison that has been made is that it would be equivalent to about 15 coal-fired power plants at a time when Oregon is recognizing that we need to move away from such electricity sources. We can't afford to build a project that would have that great of an impact. And then there's, of course, the direct safety impacts of wildfires, earthquakes and tsunamis on the terminal in Coos Bay, and the risk of explosions, because pipelines do rupture and they do explode, and it happens often enough that it really presents an acute threat. And then there's some other more subtle, not as immediate to jump to mind impacts, like the noise pollution that would come from the construction of this massive project, but also the ongoing operation of the LNG terminal, and from compressor stations like one that would be built outside of Klamath Falls. I'm going to talk a little bit more about compressor station impacts in this slide about air quality. So I'm just looking at a case study in Klamath County, which is where the origin of the pipeline would be. This region already has an F grade on air quality from the American Lung Association. It happens to be a region where a lot of poor air quality gets kind of socked in and trapped in the Klamath Basin before air patterns move it on. And so building this construction with all of the heavy machinery that requires, and then the compressor station that would be running on an ongoing basis would contribute to already poor air quality in this region. And so this chart here helps to break down exactly what it is that all of these different pieces of gas infrastructure would be spewing into the air, right? And so this first row here, compressor stations and pipelines, would be emitting all of these different fine particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and lead, right? And then there's all of these things are also caused by LNG facilities like the one proposed in Coos Bay. And then these bottom two rows are not as relevant here. They refer to other types of projects, but there's still just an enormous amount of impact that these facilities would have on an ongoing basis. I talked a little bit about the drinking water impacts. I want to add just like a little bit of extra data into this. In the construction process itself, they do this thing called pipeline seal testing, where they have to run a bunch of water through a pipeline to make sure that it's not leaking, which means that you get between 16 to 60 million gallons of fresh water that would be running through pipeline as it's being laid into place, that would then be discharged with all of this crud from the lining of the pipeline in the water that then is just discharged off into the local environment. So even before you talk about the possibility of a rupture, an explosion, a leak, a major leak, just the construction process itself flushes an enormous amount of water through the pipelines just to test their seal testing. And so the routine amount of work that actually needs to go into the building of this pipeline, if all goes according to plan, would still contaminate an enormous amount of fresh water. And then naturally surface and groundwater are threatened by all of the things that could go wrong, right? Explosions, but also construction blasting and the erosion and water diversions that would need to happen for the massive construction of this major pipeline. And one of the things that's particularly galling is that in the environmental impact statement, the project proponents have said that they would truck in or pipe in water to a contaminated water system. But that is just an unbelievable promise to make that would just be costly, difficult, and in some cases impossible, to literally truck in water into remote communities who have their watersheds contaminated. That is an unbelievable promise, and is not something that I think anybody really trusts. So I've already talked about it a little bit, right? So the reason why a massive pipeline like the one proposed in Southern Oregon is such a big concern, and in fact a much bigger concern than gas infrastructure that might feed into your home, for example, is that it is much larger and much higher pressure than a residential gas line, which are usually only a few inches in diameter and much smaller PSI, right? So the Pacific Connector would be 36 inches in diameter and 1800 PSI. And we have some data around from the US Departments of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration that has recorded an enormous amount of serious incidents, 858 in the 1996 to 2016 20-year span, with 347 fatalities and over 1,300 injuries. So pipelines do rupture, and as this map in the lower right shows, this is the wildfire potential along the proposed pipeline route, right? And with climate change, we're already seeing much more extreme wildfires in Southern Oregon, and it would likely only get much worse if there were more pipeline explosions and ruptures in the region. I want to talk a little bit about the economic impacts, and I would say that in this particular moment, when we're seeing enormous layoffs from the restaurant sector and the service sector from the public health crisis that we're experiencing right now, we know that there are health impacts when you lose your job, right? In the United States, so many people rely on their employment for healthcare coverage. And so in addition to having the disposable income that you need in order to take good care of your health and pay your copays and things like that, when people lose their jobs, it also puts their health at great jeopardy because of the way that healthcare in the United States functions. And so it's a big concern to look at the different industries that are in Southern Oregon that would be disrupted by LNG tankers, as Francis was telling us. These are jobs in crabbing, fishing, shellfish industries on the coast. LNG tankers would massively jam up the vessel traffic in Coos Bay and severely limit the amount of fishing boats that could come in and out in order to do their job. And this is a multi-million-dollar industry. It's really, we're not talking about just a handful of jobs here. We're talking about a major trade-off here. The proponents often talk about, oh, we're going to bring new jobs to Coos Bay, but the number of temporary jobs might be, considerable. The number of permanent jobs that would be created by this project just pale in comparison to the number that would likely be lost in the thriving industries that already exist in the region. And it's also worth pointing out that there's a number of other economic impacts, like the cost of firefighting in the event of one of these major explosions. Increased pressure on local housing markets in an area where affordable housing is already a big need. Reduced air quality means reduced productivity and lost work days and sick days. And it's worth pointing out that the clean energy industry is just absolutely, taking off, and it makes far more sense to invest in those kinds of jobs for the region that are not going to disrupt existing industries. And of course, gas is not a bridge fuel. This is something that is often spoken of in climate circles, right? As we transition off of coal and oil, let's use gas because, oh, it's natural and it burns cleaner. Well, that's unfortunately one of the biggest myths that we have ever been sold, because so-called natural gas is almost entirely made up of methane, which is the second most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere after carbon dioxide, and which accounts for 1/3 of all human-caused global greenhouse gas warming. A single molecule of methane traps 86 times more heat than a single molecule of CO2 over a 20-year time period. And scientists have really been telling us that it's this short-term, near-term future that matters the most for reaching our climate goals. So it really matters a lot that we don't fall victim to this myth, and in fact, make sure that we talk about methane gas for what it really is, which is 67% of the methane used in the United States comes from hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which is why it is accurate to call it fracked gas, since most of the gas used in different parts of the country, or what would be piped through this pipeline to be exported to foreign markets, would mostly be coming from US fracking. So let's call it what it is. It's not natural gas, it's fracked gas. And even if only 2.3% of methane is released in the course of transporting it from extraction site to final consumption, then it is likely on par with the climate impacts of coal. So it's not a bridge fuel. It's in fact a bridge to disaster. And then just kind of wrapping up here, I wanted to touch upon the fact that there really is a major reason why climate change is a public health emergency of its own right. Health professionals worldwide have really called that out. This is a really helpful chart that looks at the various ways in which climate is making acute health crises worse in different parts of the world. In Oregon, we see this in a number of different ways. We see it from rising summer temperatures to wetter winters, impacts to drinking water from things like harmful algal blooms, and much more extreme wildfire seasons with smokier weather that we are not prepared for. So there's a lot of different reasons why we need to be concerned about mitigating the impacts of climate change and building resiliency to climate change, and not making it worse by building a project that would emit 15 times the Boardman coal plant's carbon emissions. And that's about it for me. This is my final slide where I have some information on where you can go to get a deeper dive in the issues that I've been talking about. If you don't want to remember this long URL, I've taken the liberty of making a smaller one. So tinyurl.com/PSR gas report will take you to our in-depth report on the health impacts of fracked gas projects like the Jordan Cove LNG facility. And it very specifically goes through different case studies of the Jordan Cove LNG project to help break down what the various impacts of that are. You can also follow us on social media, and you can always send me an email if you'd like to talk about anything that I've mentioned in my presentation.
Damon, thank you so much for that. Certainly sounds like it's time for the Green New Deal. So I want to thank our three speakers, but now I'd like to also introduce Anu Sawkar from the Coastal Law Project. I don't know what I just did to my screen, but it doesn't look right.
That was me. I just stopped sharing.
You look great.
Okay. Not sure what I don't know how to change that. Anyway, Anu is the Coastal Law Project Fellow with the Cragg Law Center. And she, along with the other speakers, is going to answer questions. So I'm going to introduce her, and then I'm going to turn it over to Felice to help us with some Q&A.
All right.
So Anu was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, but grew up in Portland. She graduated from Whitman College with a BA in politics and a minor in economics, and earned her JD with a concentration in advocacy from Cornell Law School. She joined Cragg Law Center staff in January of 2019 and immediately plunged into representing Oregon shores on a wide range of issues, notably in the many regulatory processes involved in our opposition to the proposed Jordan Cove project. So, Felice, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jane. And thanks to everybody who sent questions. Please, if you have more questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. I just wanted to start out with kind of a obvious question, and something I just wanted to ask each of the speakers. What do you think the most important thing that regular people can do to help block the Jordan Cove pipeline? Maybe we could start with you, Francis.
Letters to the editor are always important to let your neighbors know what you know about this project. I think spreading the word about why this is a bad project for Oregon, and perhaps thank Governor, well, we need to thank the state of Oregon for standing strong on doing the right thing with the Oregon permit. So whatever that takes, basically, I would say that most people can just talk to their neighbors about this and explain why they don't believe this is a good project. For one, do they know about the project? And then why it's a bad thing. So That's what most ordinary people could do about this, I think.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think just getting the word out is such an important part of it. A lot of, especially Portlanders, have never even heard of the Jordan Cove Project, and it's such a major issue in the southwest corner of our state.
Right.
Damon, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that my feeling is, yeah, I would consider myself a 20-year activist. You know, when I was when I was a kid, my parents used to take me out to the nuclear missile silos in rural Colorado, and we would support the nuns that were out protesting them. You know, so, but I would say that the thing that keeps me sustained and is able to keep me doing it for so long is that I'm doing it in community. I'm doing it with friends. And other people that are passionate about the same issue. And so I would say the most important thing is to find your people that are also passionate about the same thing, so that you can help to support each other and lift each other up in doing this. That is a wonderful thing to do. One of the ways you can do that is by joining a community organization. If you're in Southern Oregon, get to know the folks at Rogue Climate. They're really amazing advocates. If you're in Portland, you know, you can get involved with a group like Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, you know, move your money around to the groups that are doing the work that's so essential in protecting from these kinds of projects.
Thanks so much. We got another question that mentioned that Francis said the pipeline runs through 1/3 of public and 2/3 private lands, but has a significant impact on indigenous watersheds. The question asked how much of the proposed pipeline runs through indigenous lands, and is it treated legally differently? I thought maybe Anu, you might be able to speak to that.
Well, if I could just mention, 100% of the pipeline runs through ancestral lands.
Yes.
So, and as far as ownership of tribal lands, I don't think the pipeline runs through lands they currently own, but it certainly 100% runs through historic tribal lands.
Great point.
There are different legal, and that was an excellent answer, Francis. One thing I'm going to say is that I learned so much from all of these other speakers. It's incredible how large and just how complex this project is. I've been doing it for a year, and sometimes that feels like 10 years. And then other times I feel like I've been doing it for 5 months. So yeah, that's an excellent answer, Francis. It does 100% go through the ancestral lands of a number of different tribes, and a number of different tribes have participated in processes, both state, local, and federal. There are legal differences. I cannot speak to them explicitly. I am not a tribal lawyer, nor do I represent any of the tribes. I just do know there are differences. I would recommend checking out a couple of Rogue Climate's actually press releases today, which do include statements by spokespeople from the tribes. You can learn a little more about how tribes state they are being impacted.
And does anyone have suggestions for other ways? I mean, if we get to do this as a live event later in the year, I hope maybe we could get some tribal voices involved. It's something we should have worked on more seriously, I think, but other ways that we can make sure that we have the tribal opposition forefront in our movement. I don't know if, Francis, if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it would be best to hear from tribal members themselves and from tribal lawyers themselves. And so the next time we do this, let's invite a bunch to speak.
Definitely. Awesome. We had a couple other questions. The whole process of quick take, I didn't realize that was really a thing. Is there any recourse against it, or no, how is that legal? Because that's an Anu question.
I was actually curious. This is really interesting. Craig Lawsoner does not represent landowners. I'm a little bit of a legal nerd, and a while back I was actually, and I'm wondering if Pam probably knows more about this. Quick take was a really strange thing to learn about in law school. I do remember being a Supreme Court case last fall, or something that was a challenge to quick take. And I think it was a pipeline on the East Coast where a landowner had at least brought it up to the circuit level. I don't know if the Supreme Court took that challenge or not. I do know, and this is vague, I'd have to do a little more research about it, that it is related to certain loopholes in the Natural Gas Act, the same loophole that allows a corporation, a foreign corporation in this case, to eminent domain the lands of private citizens in Oregon. The Natural Gas Act, a quick take, I mean, the basic definition of it is essentially the government can begin activities on someone's land before eminent domain or that process has been adjudicated. And it accrues primarily the benefit of energy companies. I would be curious to know what happened to that Supreme Court case, because if they actually took it up, and I haven't heard anything about it, maybe there could be a recourse. If they didn't take it up, what would be kind of unfortunate there is a number of the challenges kind of reinforce the right of energy companies to do that, which, you know, I can see with all of you in a lot of the comments, like, it's inexplicable. It's like really crazy that something like that could happen. But yeah, I have a very general knowledge of it, and probably far less than Francis or Pam, because I was just reading about it out of interest. Our work at CRAG has, we represent Oregon Shores, the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. And you know, Francis and Damon spoke a lot about estuarine impacts. Our primary focus has been anything between, well, mostly in Coos County, but pipeline impacts and estuarine impacts in Coos County, both the hazards associated with this project and human health hazards, coastal access, and impacts, of course, to the environment. So I am not by any means a take expert like Francis and Pam.
I'll jump in and tell you that I'm not an attorney, nor do I represent one on TV, but I've learned a little bit about quick take, and don't take it to the bank, because it's simply my understanding, and the way it's been explained to us is that if the pipeline company does get their certificate of convenience and is authorized to use the eminent domain, and the pipeline company and the landowner do not come to an agreement, they can file for quick take. And what that does is they go to the court and they say, this is costing me so much money fiddling around with these landowners that I need to get going. I can't wait to negotiate. And so they are allowed to go ahead and start with their process, while concurrently the landowner is working with the pipeline company trying to negotiate the condemnation through the court system. So they're kind of, the quick take is off to the side, and the landowner and the pipeline company are trying to come to terms. And what has happened, and I think back east, what happened in one of these situations is that the pipeline company went through and cut down like 200-year-old maple trees.
Right.
And in the meantime, the landowner is going through the court trying to come to terms as to how much they're going to be compensated, but they don't get any compensation until the terms are agreed upon. So the landowner is kind of hamstrung. They don't have any compensation, but they're losing their land, and the pipeline company gets to go through. And what the court will do is they'll make the pipeline company say, well, for example, let's just throw out $100,000 because it's an easy figure. They'll say, okay, we think that ultimately you're going to be paying the landowner somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000. So you need to put that in escrow. So the pipeline company puts that money somewhere, but the landowner doesn't necessarily have access to it. And what that does to the landowner is it puts a lot of pressure on them, because they're trying to pay attorneys and experts and whatever, you know, costs they're accruing. They don't have access to those funds, to that battle, to fight that battle. So it puts a lot of pressure on the landowner to get him to the table, is ultimately what it is. So that's my understanding of it. And you referenced that you thought there was a court that went, or there was a case
I just pulled it up. It was Givens, and that was where, what I was following. I just saw that they didn't take it up, which
Yeah, they did. And I think that's, they're going to challenge that again.
I would hope so. Yeah, that was the case I was mentioning. Essentially just, you're just, and exactly what you're saying, you're just barreling onto private land before any process has been adjudicated, before you've actually paid. And essentially you're barreling onto land before you're paying for access and doing irreparable damage, like those maple trees.
Yeah.
And it's just such a racket that this sort of thing could even happen.
It is unbelievable. The Natural Gas Act is an interesting animal.
It's to me, it's just evidence that the oil and gas industry has been able to use a huge amount of corporate cash to influence decision makers and lawmakers so that they could take this thing, which eminent domain was originally meant for things like roads, government buildings, public utilities, the kinds of things that were deemed as like, this is necessary for the like public infrastructure of our own country, to then co-opt and twist that in order to give a private corporation, not even based in the United States, profits to export a gas product that is also, degrading the health of fracking communities out to a foreign market for sale. It's absolutely ludicrous that could then say that that's in the public benefit of the landowners in Southern Oregon. And, this morning, FERC Chairman Chatterjee said that it will bring untold economic and environmental benefits to the world, and that's why it counted as a public benefit, which is just, not true and absolutely, just outrageous.
Let's try to get through just a couple more questions, and then, everybody's had a long day at home probably. Pertinent to today, what are the likely legal actions to follow from FERC, from the FERC decision today and from the coastal zone management appeal? I don't know.
I can speak generally about, we've talked a little bit about the FERC decision. Francis and Pam have mentioned the landowners lawsuit, and I believe that's the Niskanen Center. And they're doing excellent work. I know there's another attorney representing landowners, I believe Carolyn Elephant, I'm not sure, but that's more of a due process issue, and really important. And is it David Bookbinder? He wrote some really great letters in the FERC docket. I highly encourage everyone to take a look. In terms of, I believe in the press release, everyone should take a look at that press release. I know the Sierra Club is seeking a rehearing of FERC's decision itself to authorize both the Section 7 application and the Section 3 application. And I always mix up which one's the pipeline and which one's the terminal, but one of them is a certificate of convenience for the pipeline, and the other one is just the siting authorization for the terminal itself. In terms of the CZMA, and again, the Coastal Law Project is a collaboration between CRAG and Oregon Shores. Oregon Shores, we represented Oregon Shores in participating in a number of the coalition comments for the CZMA certification. So the CZMA certification is something that gas pipeline companies are required to present to the FERC and agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, certifying that they comply with the state, and in this case, the state of Oregon's enforceable policies in the coastal zone. And so for us, that's between the coastal range to, the continental shelf, but it is 52 miles of the pipeline, and Coos Estuary is in Oregon's coastal zone. The DLCD, as Damon mentioned, issued an objection to that. That objection was appealed by Jordan Cove, and there was initially, it can go one of two ways. Either the Secretary of Commerce, and that's maybe too complicated to discuss now, but the Secretary of Commerce is the person who hears an appeal of a coastal zone objection. The Secretary of Commerce or an applicant can challenge an objection letter by a state. In this case, Jordan Cove challenged the objection letter. And now the Secretary will hear it. The state of Oregon is going to have to at some point
Defend it.
defend it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the two other permits that are necessary for the project, Jordan Cove LNG has not yet reapplied for either the Clean Water Act permit
Right.
or the remote removal fill permit. And
The
the
state
reason,
removal fill. Yeah. So
yes,
the
thank you,
401
the
is
state,
the, yeah.
yeah, the state Clean Water Act and state removal fill permit, but those are federal authorizations that are granted to the state, and so that can't be appealed in the same way that the coastal zone authorization can be appealed.
Right.
So that matters.
It really does. One other thing I will say, and we were talking about how Felice people can challenge, or what people can do in their lives to, raise their voice in opposition to this project, which so many people have said is not good for Oregon or not good for Oregon's people. The DEQ, and this was tucked into the director's report recently, the DEQ is going to be considering modifications to another water quality permit, right? Another federally authorized water quality permit that's within the jurisdiction of the Department of Environmental Quality here. And that's something called a national, it's an NPDES, it's a National Pollution
discharge
elimination system permit, which NPDES. So that's, again, a request for a wastewater treatment system. That will probably open up for public comment at some point before June of this year. So that's one way people can still participate in comment period.
I would recommend that you get onto an email list of one of the groups that's working to translate these incredibly dense and complicated permitting processes into layman's terms so that we can all digest and understand what really is at play here, and then add our voice in a substantial way. And that does two things. It tells the state agency that there are so many Oregonians opposed to these permits. And then it also helps us to build a narrative, right? It helps us to be able to say, oh my gosh, there were tens of thousands of everyday Oregonians who weighed in on a project that is not in the public interest. That helps us to build this overall narrative that tells decision makers that they're going to be wildly unpopular for continuing to support something like this.
It's so important, Damon, like really, if you look at the DLCD decision, there is a section in there, and everyone should take a look at that letter. They state the number of comments they got, over 20,000 comments, and 80% of those comments were opposed on something as complicated. Like, when you just hear that word, CZMA certification, I know a lot of people's eyes go like glazed, right? Like, what is that? But it's a huge, I guess, a huge stick that the state has to protect our coast. And it's also great for them to see 80% of people who told us anything about this really, really did not like this idea and really disagreed with a lot of the, I guess, certifications put forth by this applicant, that it would have no impacts, or the mitigation would be just fine and perfect. Like, people opposed that, and it mattered.
We were in a radically different place with the state of Oregon a year ago than we are now. And now the state agencies understand this project really thoroughly and know just how widespread and thorough the opposition is. And so I think one of the most important ways to get involved as we enter the next phase of this process is to continue letting your state representative and state senator know how you feel about this project, and find every opportunity to comment on these by getting on one of these mailing lists. I see that Felice just put in nolngexports.org/join into the group chat. I would encourage everyone to get on that email list, because that's usually where the first action opportunities are distributed as soon as they become available.
I think we should wrap up soon, so I'm going to take the prerogative of moderator to ask the last question, and that is, it's a personal passion, but it just seems crazy to me that we're going to log old growth as part of this process. And I was wondering, I know that the Broads put in a objection to some of the Forest Service nonsense, but is there anything else that we can do to help protect the forests and the waterways that are going to be impacted? I know, Francis, I feel like this is your bread and butter.
Well, the federal lands cannot, unlike private lands where once they get that eminent domain right, they can start tree cutting on private lands. On federal lands, it's a little different. They can't start the tree cutting until after they have all the state permits, especially the 401 water quality permit. And then once they have that in hand, the BLM issues a right-of-way permit for the Forest Service and the BLM itself. So it'll be a long time before the trees start to come down on federal lands. I mean, hopefully it'll be a long time. What do I know? I've never been through this before, if that happens quickly or not. But, and believe me, we'll all know it. And when if it comes, and we weren't able to stop it legally with the request for rehearing, which is being put in by Sierra Club and Welk, then it's time to get out there and climb those trees. What else is there to do, right?
All right. I feel like that's a great spot to leave off. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And once again, a big thank you to our speakers. And stay safe out there. Keep yourself healthy for the fight.
Felice and Broad, thank you so much for like putting this on and yeah, continuing it even though it was canceled.
For sure. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Have a great night, guys.
Thanks everyone.
We will.